In 1973, 8 completely healthy people walked into psychiatric hospitals across America. They said 3 words: empty, hollow, thud. All 8 were immediately admitted, diagnosed with schizophrenia, trapped for weeks. They acted totally normal once inside, but the doctors couldn't see it. The nurses couldn't see it. But you know who did? The real patients. They knew something was off. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a full-scale crisis that would shake psychiatry to its core. And the man behind it? A Stanford psychologist named David Rosenhan, who was about to expose the biggest lie in mental health. But here's the twist. 50 years later, we discover that he might have been lying too. Before we dive in, if you're new here, welcome to The Sleeping Psychologist, where I uncover the wildest experiments and biggest scandals in psychology history that you definitely slept through in class. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next mind-blowing story. And drop a comment. Would you have been able to tell who was faking and who wasn't? Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Professor with a Mission. David Rosenhan wasn't your typical psychologist. Born in 1929, he earned degrees in math, economics, and psychology before landing at Stanford in 1971. But Rosenhan had a problem with psychiatry. Actually, he had a lot of problems with it. This was the early 1970s. America was in the middle of a mental health crisis. Psychiatric hospitals were overcrowded, underfunded, and brutal. Patients were warehoused. Treatments were often barbaric: electroshock therapy, insulin coma therapy, lobotomies, and at the center of it all was diagnosis. How do you know someone is mentally ill? In 1973, psychiatrists used the DSM-2, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 2nd edition. It was vague, subjective, based more on theoretical psychoanalysis than hard science. And Rosenhan thought it was garbage. He'd seen the system up close. He'd worked with patients. He'd studied the literature. And he kept asking one question that nobody seemed able to answer. Can psychiatrists actually tell who's sane and who's insane? Or is diagnosis just guesswork dressed up in medical language? So Rosenhan decided to find out. Not through surveys or interviews. Not through reviewing case files. No, he was going undercover. He was going to send healthy people into psychiatric hospitals and see if anyone noticed. This wasn't just academic curiosity. Rosenhan was on a mission. He wanted to prove that psychiatric diagnosis was fundamentally broken. That the labels we slap on people, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, were more about the observer than the observed. That context matters more than symptoms. He had no idea his experiment would become one of the most famous and controversial studies in psychology history. Chapter 2. Operation Undercover. Here's how it worked. Rosenhan recruited 8 people. Let's call them pseudopatients, fake patients. These weren't random volunteers. They were educated, accomplished people. 3 psychologists, a psychiatrist, a pediatrician, a graduate student, a painter, a housewife. None had any history of mental illness. Rosenhan trained them carefully. They would call psychiatric hospitals and complain about hearing voices. Not complex hallucinations. Just 3 simple words: empty, hollow, thud. That's it. Once admitted, they would immediately stop faking. No more symptoms. They'd act completely normal. Answer all questions truthfully except for their names and occupations. And they'd take notes on everything they observed. There was just one catch. They had no idea how to get out. Rosenhan told them they'd have to convince the staff they were sane. On their own, no help, no exit strategy. Just act normal and hope someone notices. Between 1969 and 1972, these 8 pseudopatients presented themselves at 12 psychiatric hospitals across 5 states. The hospitals varied. Some were public, some private. Some were well-funded and prestigious, others run-down and understaffed. But the pseudopatients went in blind. They didn't know what to expect. What would happen? Would the psychiatrist see through the ruse immediately? Would a simple interview reveal they were faking? Or would the power of that initial complaint, "I hear voices," be enough to trap them inside? The pseudopatients checked in, and the results were stunning. Chapter 3. Trapped in the system, all 8 were admitted. Every single one. Not one psychiatrist suspected they might be faking. Not one nurse said, "Wait, this doesn't add up." The moment they said, "I hear voices," the machine started running. Intake forms, medical histories, diagnosis. 7 out of 8 were diagnosed with schizophrenia. 1 was labeled with manic depressive psychosis. And just like that, they were patients, locked inside psychiatric wards with no idea when or if they'd get out. Here's where it gets wild. The pseudopatients immediately stopped faking. No more voices. No more symptoms. They acted completely normal. They cooperated with staff, participated in activities, followed all the rules. And they wrote, constantly, field notes documenting everything they saw. At first, they tried to hide the note-taking, but then they realized something bizarre. Nobody cared. The staff saw them writing and just added it to their charts. Patient engages in writing behavior, as if taking notes was another symptom of their madness. And the diagnosis stuck. Once labeled schizophrenic, everything they did was filtered through that lens. One pseudopatient paced the hallways out of boredom. The nurses wrote, "Patient exhibits pacing behavior." Another arrived early to the cafeteria because there was nothing else to do. Chart note, patient displays oral acquisitive behavior. Even their real-life histories were twisted. One pseudopatient honestly described his relationship with his parents, close to his mother, distant from his father. Normal stuff. The doctors wrote it up as textbook evidence of his schizophrenia, citing ambivalent family dynamics and emotional dysfunction. But here's the creepiest part. The real patients knew. During the first 3 hospitalizations, 35 out of 118 real patients voiced suspicions. They'd say things like, "You're not crazy. You're a journalist or a professor. You're checking up on the hospital." The actual mentally ill patients could tell the difference. But the trained professionals? Not a clue. Days turned into weeks. The pseudopatients were stuck. They had to take medication. Over 2,100 pills were administered, though many were secretly flushed down toilets. They had to attend therapy sessions. They had to admit they were mentally ill, because that was the only way out. Think about that. To prove you're sane, you first have to admit you're insane. The shortest stay was 7 days. The longest? 52 days, nearly 2 months. The average was 19 days. And when they were finally released, not one was declared sane. Every discharge paper read, "Schizophrenia in remission." Not misdiagnosed, not "we made a mistake." In remission, meaning the hospital believed they were still sick, just not showing symptoms at the moment. The pseudopatients walked out of those hospitals with psychiatric diagnoses that would follow them forever. Chapter 4. The paper that broke psychiatry. On January 19, 1973, the journal Science, one of the most prestigious scientific publications in the world, published Rosenhan's findings. The title? On Being Sane in Insane Places. It was a bombshell. Rosenhan's argument was devastating. He wasn't just saying psychiatrists made mistakes. He was saying psychiatric diagnosis itself was unreliable. That the labels we use, schizophrenia, psychosis, depression, are so subjective that healthy people can be trapped in hospitals for weeks without anyone noticing. He wrote, "It is clear that we cannot distinguish the sane from the insane in psychiatric hospitals." He argued that context overpowers evidence. Once you're in a psychiatric hospital, everything you do is seen as pathological. Sane behavior becomes invisible. The reaction was explosive. Psychiatrists were furious, embarrassed, defensive. How could this happen? How could trained professionals miss something so obvious? One of the loudest critics was Robert Spitzer, a psychiatrist working on the next version of the DSM. Spitzer called Rosenhan's study pseudoscience presented as science. He argued that Rosenhan had rigged the game. Of course, psychiatrists admitted people who said they heard voices, that's their job. Hallucinations are a serious symptom. You don't turn someone away just because they seem calm during the intake interview. But Spitzer's criticism missed the point. Rosenhan wasn't mad that the pseudopatients were admitted. He was mad that they couldn't get out. That once labeled, their sanity became invisible. That the system couldn't self-correct. Still, psychiatry had to respond, and they did with a challenge. Chapter 5. The Double Trap. One psychiatric hospital read Rosenhan's study and said, "That would never happen here. We're better than that. Send us your fake patients. We'll catch them." Rosenhan smiled. "Okay," he said. "I'll send you several pseudopatients over the next 3 months. See if you can spot them." The hospital went on high alert. Staff were briefed. Everyone was watching. Over the next 3 months, 193 new patients were admitted. The staff identified 41 people they believed were Rosenhan's fake patients. 41 suspected pseudopatients flagged by psychiatrists, nurses, and other staff members. They were confident. They'd proven they could tell the difference. But here's the twist. Rosenhan sent 0 people. Not one. Every single patient the hospital admitted during that period was real. 41 real patients, people genuinely seeking help, were suspected of faking. Accused of being part of an experiment. Treated with suspicion instead of care. Rosenhan had flipped the script. First, he showed that hospitals couldn't identify fake patients. Then he showed they'd see fake patients where none existed. The system wasn't just broken, it was biased in both directions. This second phase of the experiment was never formally published, but Rosenhan mentioned it in talks and interviews. And it was just as damning as the first. Psychiatry was in crisis. The Rosenhan experiment became required reading in medical schools. It shaped policy debates. It influenced the deinstitutionalization movement, the push to close psychiatric hospitals and treat patients in the community. And it directly impacted the development of DSM-3, which tried to make diagnosis more objective and criteria-based. David Rosenhan became a legend, a crusader for reform, a man who'd exposed the truth about psychiatry's biggest lie. But was he telling the truth? Chapter 6. The investigator who uncovered the lie. Fast forward to 2015. Susannah Cahalan, a journalist and author, decided to write a book about the Rosenhan experiment. She admired Rosenhan. She wanted to tell the stories of the brave pseudopatients who'd gone undercover. There was just one problem. She couldn't find them. Rosenhan had never revealed their identities. Cahalan started digging. She went through Rosenhan's archived files at the Library of Congress. She hired a private investigator. She tracked down former Stanford students. And slowly, a very different picture emerged. She found exactly 2 confirmed pseudopatients, Bill Underwood and Harry Lando, both Stanford graduate students. That's it. Not 8, 2. And the more Cahalan dug, the worse it got. Rosenhan's records were a mess. Dates didn't match. Details contradicted each other. Some pseudopatients he claimed existed seemed to have never been hospitalized at all. In one case, Cahalan found a woman Rosenhan described as a pseudopatient, but medical records showed she was a real patient with a real psychiatric history. Even more damning, Rosenhan himself claimed to be one of the pseudopatients. He told dramatic stories about his own hospitalization, but Cahalan found evidence suggesting he might have exaggerated or even fabricated parts of his experience. The data he published? Inconsistent. The famous detail about 2,100 pills? Couldn't be verified. The claim about 35 patients recognizing the pseudopatients as fake? No documentation. Cahalan published her findings in 2019 in a book called The Great Pretender. Her conclusion was devastating. Rosenhan likely committed research fraud. Not all of it was fake. There were real pseudopatients, real hospitalizations. But the study was nowhere near as rigorous or reliable as Rosenhan had claimed. The experiment that destroyed psychiatry's credibility was itself deeply flawed, maybe even fraudulent. And that raises the most uncomfortable question of all. If Rosenhan lied, does that mean psychiatry was right all along? Or does a flawed study revealing a real problem still matter? Here's the thing about the Rosenhan experiment. It's complicated. Yes, Rosenhan likely exaggerated. Yes, his data was messy. Yes, he might have fabricated parts of his study. But that doesn't mean he was completely wrong. Psychiatric diagnosis in the 1970s was unreliable. Hospitals were brutal. Patients were mistreated. The DSM-2 was vague and subjective. Rosenhan's experiment flawed as it was forced psychiatry to confront those problems. It pushed the field toward more rigorous, evidence-based diagnosis. It sparked conversations about patient rights, the dangers of labeling, and the power dynamics inside psychiatric institutions. But it also shows the danger of letting one dramatic study shape an entire field. We believed Rosenhan because his story was so compelling. We wanted it to be true. And for 50 years, nobody checked his work. Science isn't about heroes and villains. It's about evidence. And sometimes the evidence tells us that even the studies we love are more complicated than they seem. So what do we take away from this? Maybe it's that skepticism matters. That we should question authority, even the authorities we agree with. That a good story isn't the same as good science. And maybe, just maybe, it's a reminder that the line between sane and insane, between truth and deception, is a lot blurrier than any of us want to admit. If you liked this deep dive into psychology's most controversial experiment, check out my video on the Stanford prison experiment, another famous study that didn't go quite the way we thought. And remember, I'm the sleeping psychologist. I dig up the stories you slept through. So subscribe, hit that notification bell, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay curious.